Hopefully you brought a raincoat and a boat. We're going to need both. How thankful we are for the rain, but also for the ability to get out of it. Now, if you were one that falls asleep to the rain sound, I don't want to hear it tonight. I gave you the best pass in the world this morning. I said two things. I sent you home what to do, and that was to eat and sleep was our lesson this morning. So all of the ability this morning and this afternoon, hopefully you got some good rest and took something away from our lesson. If you would be getting your Bibles out, we're going to look at part 2 of our lesson we began this morning, dealing with overcoming discouragement. And as we look at this idea of overcoming discouragement, what it means, we were looking at 1 Kings chapter 19 specifically. And while we look at 1 Kings chapter 19, we had made our way just about to verse number 19. And in case you were not here this morning, we're going to go very quickly through the things that we had talked about. And we sat with Elijah underneath the broom tree. That's really where we left this morning. We left at him at his lowest point after what can be argued to be his greatest triumph. We saw in 1 Kings chapter 18 this great thing that he does, overcoming these prophets of Baal, 850 prophets, against this one single man of God. And as he goes out and he does that, he goes in chapter 19 and he gets this letter from Jezebel, and it discourages him to the point he's basically through with life. He's done with it. He's done with everything that's going on. He's done with wanting to desire anymore. And so he runs off. And remember, as you read in verses 19 and following, it says in verse number 4 that he is no better than his fathers. Not only is he no better than his fathers, he says he wants his own life to be taken. He says he's hit the point where there's nothing more to do, there's nothing more that he can say, and he's just ready for his life to end. And this is on the tail end, as we mentioned, of what happened in 1 Kings chapter 18. So with those things in mind, we talked about what God does in order for you and I to overcome discouragement. And there's really 3 things that we saw take place as we went through 1 Kings chapter 18, and chapter 19. And those 3 things were, he fed him, he met him, and he corrected the lie. Remember the lie that he said in verse number 4, where he said, I'm not better than my fathers. And then remember, twice he talked about being by himself. If you remember looking at verse number 10, he said specifically that he was alone. He says, I'm by myself. Here I am under this juniper tree. I'm by myself. There's nothing more for me to do. And so God correcting that is going to do something for him that's going to allow him to overcome that discouragement even more. Remember what he did and what he said to do. He told him in verse number 11, that first word specifically, to go. There was still work for him to do. There was still something that he had to do in his life. And as he went, remember, God revealed himself to him. We saw the scene that happens as God is revealed, and he's not revealed. He gives him this wind and this earthquake and this fire. But it's that small, still voice where Elijah ultimately hears God. And so as you go with me, I want you to look specifically at verse 15 and 16. As we get into our lesson tonight, verse 15 and 16 of 1 Kings chapter 19 says, And the Lord said unto him, Go return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi shall thou anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room. Now as you stop there, remember the very first word that he gave him, God gave to Elijah, was to go. And he gave him in verse 16 and 15 and 16 the exact prescription. This is what I want you to do. I don't want you to go down this any longer as far as going by yourself. There's specific things that I want you to set in motion. And that's such an important piece from what we talked about this morning, because there is a time to rest. There is a time to recover. But now, what does God tell him to do? Now it's time to get back up and there's work to do. And so whenever he tells him and get back up and there's work to do, you notice that God has already had a plan in motion. That here Elijah was at the base of this broom tree, but God is already working and allowing Elijah now to fulfill what he has planned. And so as Elijah goes, it says in verse number 17 exactly what would happen. And it shall come to pass that him that escapeth the sword of Hazael shall Jehu slay, and him that escapeth from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha slay. So when he tells him, go and return on thy way, he gives him the specific things he wants him to do and follow. He says, this is what I want you to do. And that discouragement that he had back at the beginning of chapter 19 is answered by this assignment that God is going to give him. Remember in verse number 18, we talked about when we left off this morning, it says, "Yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which have not kissed him." Now remember, if you think back to where we left off, whenever Elijah is talking about his life, and he's saying things such as, "I'm by myself, I've done all of this, what good has it done, I'm alone." He's answering this and thinking nobody else has been through this, nobody else knows what's going on. And God answers him, remember, you're not by yourself. There are people out here who are going through the exact same thing, who are going through things that you as well have went through in your life, and that's the answer for you and I as well. Is that we may feel isolated, and that's what discouragement whispers in our ears. It tells you you're by yourself, you're alone. But ultimately, God is telling us here, no, you're not. And if we would simply reach out and maybe reach out to those who have been with it as well, imagine what it could do for us. And so he gives them this word in verse 18. God tells him specifically no. He corrects that lie that he had told himself, that he was by himself, that there's nobody there else with him. And these people are all around you and I every day. It's mothers, it's fathers, it's co-workers, it's friends, it's family, whoever it is. There are people out here as well going through what we're going through. And that's why it's so important that we rely on each other. Whenever you read, and if you want to jot this down next to verse 18, Paul in Romans 11, verses 4 and 5, this is what he quotes whenever he talks about God always leaving a remnant, God always having people. And this is where he goes back to in quotes. It's 1 Kings chapter 19. But ultimately, where we're going to look at is verse number 19. Because we see a great transition take place and a great fulfillment happen in Elijah's life. So as you go through verse number, basically everywhere up through verse number 18, he's told him all of this. He's led him out of this discouragement, but his work is still not done. No, he's missing one thing that he does not have yet, and that is a companion. So look at verse number 19 with me. Verse 19 says, "So he departed thence and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he was with the 12th. And Elijah passed by him and cast his mantle upon him." Now, what exactly just happened there in verse number 19? So Elijah is this great prophet of God, and he is this man who has done so much against the works of Baal, against these idols. He's done so much, but remember, he's missing that key. He's missing a companion. And so in verse number 19, he comes down off the mountain. He makes this great journey that's hundreds of miles long. He regains his strength. He goes down this, and he comes to and finds this guy. And I want you to look in verse 19. What is he doing whenever he finds this guy in verse 19? He finds him, and he's plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and it says, which one is he with? It says he's with the 12. That means he's back in with the plow, working alongside them, working and doing his part whenever they're doing their farming and doing their plowing. And in verse 19, it says this man is called Elisha. And what exactly does Elijah do? He goes, and it says he puts his mantle upon him. Basically, you would take your mantle, and this is a way that they would almost pronounce you a prophet, if you would. They would put the mantle, they would take the mantle off. The mantle's kind of that outer coat. They would take it off and put it on someone else. And so as Elijah, he's basically, that's where you hear the phrase, passing the mantle on. That's the idea we get it from. He is passing that mantle, and he is handing it over to Elisha. So he puts the mantle on him. Now, who is Elisha at this point? He is a man, would you say that he is a successful man? Well, it says here that he's the son of Shaphat, and they've got 12 yoke of oxen, so that's 12 pairs. You've got 24 oxen there. They've got all of these fields, so evidently he has a prosperous farm. He has a prosperous job, and he's about to go and trade that for what can be considered one of the hardest, loneliest, maybe most dangerous professions of all time, which is being a prophet of God. And whenever he does that in verse number 19, you think about all of the things that he could do. Now, Elijah doesn't say he goes up to him and says any words. It says he passed by him and gives one gesture, no words. He puts his mantle upon him, and Elisha understood immediately. And so whenever you think about passing that mantle, whenever Elijah threw that on Elisha, he says, this burden, this mantle is now yours. This job and this journey is now yours. Now, what did Elijah also fulfill for himself? Because the next 10 years or so, you realize Elisha is going to be right there with Elijah. And he's going to be with him every day of that journey and with him as a part of his life. And that one thing of discouragement that had hurt Elijah so deeply is now fulfilled. Remember, he says, I'm by myself, I'm alone. And God told him not any longer, because he is now gone and selected Elisha. So continue reading there in verses 20 and 21. And I want you to think about the question of, what would you do if you are Elisha? What do you do right here in verse 19, where you have this, you have all of your life ahead of you, you have a prosperous farm, you have a prosperous business, you've got the work to do, and this man comes up and puts the mantle on you. What are you willing to do? Whenever Mark chapter 1 verse 17, whenever you and I studied through the book of Mark, and we looked in chapter 1 where Jesus is first calling his apostles, whenever he says, come ye after me, and I will make you to become fishers of men, he's saying to leave behind all that you know you are in pursuit of all that you can be. And in this case, Elijah is now stuck, and the question is, what exactly will Elijah do? Well, keep reading with me down in verses 20 and 21. It says, and he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow thee. And he said unto him, go back again, for what have I done to thee? And he returned back from him and took a yoke of oxen and slew them and boiled their flesh with the instruments of the oxen and gave unto the people, and they did eat. Then he arose and went after Elijah and ministered unto him, through verse 21. So of all of the things Elisha can do, he goes and he takes these oxen that are in front of him, he takes the plows, and what does he do? He burns them and he leaves them behind. And whenever you think about the fulfillment of what Elijah said earlier, that I'm by myself in this, that I have nobody else to rely on, no, that answer was not true. You are not alone. Elisha not only leaves behind his profession, he basically makes it so you can't return. Now, 6 months from now, whenever Elisha is along this and it gets really tough, he thinks, boy, this is tough. I don't know about this. What does he have to go back to now? Nothing. He has burned the plow. He has left it all behind. He used it, and then you want to see what he does here in verse 21. He takes those 24 oxen, those 12 yoke of oxen, cooks them, and then what does it say? Gave them unto the people that they did eat. He is liquidating everything he has. And he's saying, nope, there is no coming back. And you think about what it means to pursue the Lord for you and I today. There is no going back at this point. There's no going back to the farm. There's no going back and getting my old job. There is a moment in every one of our walks as Christians where the plow has to be burned and we walk ahead. Where we leave behind that thing that has us stuck in the world. And what that means is maybe it's the thing that we use to crawl back into our old life. The thing that we hold on to that we just can't get rid of yet. The thing that we don't want to get rid of. For some of us, it's a relationship that maybe we know we should not be part of. For others of us, it may be something in the medicine cabinet. It may be something, it may be a bottle that we cannot get rid of. For all of us, though, there's a plow that we have to get rid of and ultimately burn to move ahead and walk forward. And the question is whether or not we'll do it whenever the time comes for us to choose. Am I choosing to let go, choosing to release the world, or am I choosing to hold on to those things and look back? In Luke 9, verse 62, Jesus said, no man having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. Can't you see him picturing this scene as he says that? And Elisha taking this, he burns the plows, there's no turning back, and then he is going to go. And I want you to think about what exactly he does. It says at the end of verse 21, he arose and went after Elijah and ministered there unto him. So he does, before he goes, in verse number 20, say goodbye to his family. He says goodbye to them, and then he makes it very clear he's not turning back. And for the next 10 years or so, he served with Elijah. He waited on Elijah. He attended with him. And the next 60 years of Elisha's life are going to be done in service to God. All because of this moment, he chose not to turn back and instead chose to move on and go ahead. Now, stop and look at the whole arc that we have in front of us from chapter 19. At the beginning of this chapter, think about how different we ended in verse 21 versus how we started back in verse 1. In verse 1, you were told about this man who had had this great victory, who had reduced himself into hiding, found this little bitty broom tree that's barely a shrub to find shade. He's depressed. He's discouraged. And he says, I'm ready for my life to end. He says, I'm by myself. He says, there's nothing more for me to do. And at the end of the chapter, God gives him this companion. He tells him that he's not alone. And he gives him a job and work to do. What exactly does the Lord do for someone discouraged? Well, in this case, he gave him a companion, Elisha. Elisha's name, by the way, means God is salvation. And so that sermon in and of itself is what it meant to Elijah. And sometimes Elisha is different people. Sometimes for you and I, it's a friend. Maybe it's a brother or sister in Christ. Maybe it's a spouse. Whoever it may be, there are people and companions in our life that we can rely on. God has never asked us to walk alone, and he never will. And that means more than just other people around us as well. But there is one thing before we quit, and we look at this chapter we have to look at, because all of this is ultimately pointing ahead to Christ. And I want you to compare something with me. Keep your thumb there in 1 Kings 19, and then flip ahead to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. Whenever you get over there, I want you to think about what God did for Elijah and how he used Elijah and how these things ultimately point to Jesus. And I want us to walk through three specific pieces here that I think point us directly to Christ. The first one is as you consider the first prayer that happens in 1 Kings chapter 19. In verse number 4, Elijah's prayer is the lowest point of his life. And what does he ask God to do? He asks God to take away my life. When you open up Matthew chapter 26, and you're studying and reading in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it's talking in verse number 39, and you're seeing the scene unfold of the Son of God himself sweating, as it were, great drops of blood, and he's praying. What does he pray in verse 39? If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. If there is any other way, let this cup, let this burden pass away from me. Well, if you think about the two lowest points here, Elijah under the broom tree and Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing what is ahead and knowing he has to bear it anyways, Elijah, he asked for his life to end. Jesus asked if there is any other way. For Elijah, the answer was, yes, I'm not going to grant you that. Ultimately, the answer was no, that his life was going to be spared. But for Jesus, the answer was there's no other way. There's no other way than through the way of the cross. And so that you and I today, as we sit under that broom tree and have that discouragement, that there's something you and I can do. But there's another scene, and we actually talked about it here a couple of weeks ago, that I think is fascinating. Go to John chapter 21. The second comparison that we see coming from this scene in chapter 19, I think we find in John chapter 21. Whenever you remember going back in 1 Kings 19, as Elijah is there under the broom tree, it says in verses 5 and 6, I'm going to read this to you while you turn over to John 21. This is from 1 Kings 19, verses 5 and 6. And as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, behold, then an angel touched him and said unto him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was a cake baking on the coals and a cruse of water at his head, and he did eat and drink and laid him down again. Now, that should hopefully sound familiar to us. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at John chapter 21, and that was where we had seen Jesus after he was risen, after the resurrection had occurred, and he is standing on the beach, and he's standing in front of a fire of coals. And remember, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the word for that fire specifically. The Greek is called anthrakaia. And it's this fire, it's only used 2 times in the New Testament to describe this fire that they have, and it's being burned with coals. The only other time it occurs is in John 18, verse 18. Remember, we're talking about it evoking that response, because that's the same fire that Peter saw when he smelled when he denied Christ. And so on the beach scene, as this is taking place, what I want to show you that's so amazing is that the Hebrew word used for that coal over here in 1 Kings 19 is the Greek sister word to what we see happening in John 21. That those two scenes are the same, and whenever you think about what it means, that coal of fire in the wilderness being a shadow of what would happen later. The Lord's coal on the lakeshore, that is the fulfillment. And whenever you see that fulfillment taking place, what does Jesus say exactly about the bread. What does he say about this bread that he has? Remember, he says to simply come and dine. He will say in Matthew chapter 11 and verse number 28, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Thirdly, we see the companion that Elijah was given, also fulfilled in Christ. If you think about what you and I have today, Elijah was given Elisha. Think about how much more you and I have been given. Think about all the things that we possess. We have the Word which is in front of us, the Spirit's gift to the world, to the church, that we follow it, that we have a guide. That's the beauty of this series, is none of it has to come from my mind or any human's mind. When you think about handling earthly problems, there's something we can open up and turn to, that we can know what to do. It's not a question of what can we do. We've been given the bread of life, which is the Word. We've been given that bread so that we may be able to eat and be full. We've been given the church. We've been given people that go through the same thing, that have the same problems, and we've been given that promise that we are not going to be alone in this world. Elijah thought he was alone. He was not. The thing about you and I tonight, if you think you're alone, know that you are not. And so before we close, there's one thing that we have to do as we start the week. And that is the scene we saw in verse number 19. And verses 20 and 21, whenever Elisha is picked. And that is getting rid of that thing that is holding us back. You see, the discouraged man, the man under the broom tree, he does not need 10 things to do tomorrow. He does not need 10 things to do this week. No, what he does need to do is this. He needs to get rid of the one thing that is holding him back. The one thing that is keeping him in one foot in the world and one foot following after Christ. The one thing that we have that's gripping us, that's pulling us back. We have to burn that plow. We have to end it. We have to get rid of it. We have to be able to move on. In James 5 and verse number 16, whenever we talked about that this morning, when it says, "Confess your faults one to another, that ye may be healed." If we did not do that earlier today, the option is still there for us to do it now. What that means is there's something we can actively do. And I think for all of us, there's something there that may be causing us to look back. Remember what Jesus said in Luke chapter 9, that no man going after the kingdom is turning back and looking at those lines behind him. He is looking ahead. One plow this week that is causing us to stay one foot in the world and one foot in the kingdom. What is that thing for you and I? Think about it, because you probably, if you know, probably had something pop into your head. And listen, whenever Elisha does it in verse 21, and he gets rid of that plow, is it a secret that he's done? Nope. Nope. In fact, the whole village is there. That made it real, and that made it permanent, and that made it stick. There's no turning back in 6 months. He burnt it, and if we need to tell somebody that we are going through that, I don't care whether it's an elder, a preacher, a brother, sister in Christ, a spouse, let it be known what we're going through so that we can help carry this load with you and not do it by yourself. The importance of this lesson on discouragement is that you're not alone, you're not by yourself, and there is a way out. But it's something we have to do, and it's something we actively have to do. So look one more time at Elijah's road. He sat down underneath a broom tree, and he asked God to take away his life. He asked God to end it, and God said no. And whenever God said no, Elijah came down, and he went to Horeb with a mission. He went there with the truth, and he went there with a companion to help him. Whenever you and I consider what Elijah would do after this, he trained the man that would do twice the miracles that he ever did. He stood on the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses there in Matthew chapter 17, verse 3, in the presence of Jesus, is there witnessing the scene. That's this same Elijah that asked God to take away my life. Elijah in 2 Kings chapter 2:11, do you remember how his life ended? In 2 Kings 2:11, it says that he was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire, living a life that really was never died. Elijah was named by James in the New Testament in James 5, verses 17 and 18 as the model of effective prayer. Do you realize the man who had thought he had failed, that asked God to take his life, became one of the most significant figures in the entire Bible? And that is important for you and I because that can be our story. The broom tree is not the last page. It's the place where we may be at our lowest, that we need to stop relying on self and start relying on God. And that's exactly what Elijah did. The broom tree is the place where all of this comes true and where we realize that we are not the only ones left. You're not by yourself. You're not alone in doing this. God told Elijah, he said there's 7,000. Imagine if there was 7,000 then, how many there are today. And you and I are one of them. There are more than 7,000 faithful. The same Lord who fed Elijah on the coals, met Peter on the beach in John 21, stands at the door of every single weary heart this evening, and he says something very simple. Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. This evening, if you are in need of that answering, of that call, of that invitation that Jesus gives, why not tonight to make that confession known, to make your voice heard? If you're struggling with discouragement, you're struggling with that path, that way out, know that there is a way, and know you don't have to do it alone. If you've never obeyed the gospel, remember this series is explicitly for those who are followers of God. If we want to deal with discouragement and we're not yet a Christian, the very first step is to come to Christ, to come to Him fully, completely, burning the plow and not looking back. If you're one that maybe you just have that discouragement tonight, you just may need a little bit of help. That's what we're here for as brethren. So tonight, the invitation is offered. If we can help in any way, come forward now as together we stand and sing this song of encouragement.